Mark Brady, representing the board of South Ireland.
Roger Rochelle,
Jim Trogdon, North Carolina Department of Transportation.
Louis Mitchell, Chief Engineer's Office.
Mike Russell, representing the town of Huntersville. Welcome to our town hall.
Jeff McLeod, Howard County, County Commissioner.
Kirk Knox, Town Coordinator.
Pat Cosgrove, County Commissioner at Large.
And thanks everyone for finding the new location for this meeting. Going to do the brief review as usual of reminding people, especially maybe new folks in the audience, the purpose of this group is to provide input to Secretary Trogdon to analyze the options to consider from the Mercator report. And just on cue, Jim Taylor from Mercator Associates Advisors walks in. And item B is assess the potential changes for the Express Lanes project's scope and pre-3 contract. Since this is the anticipated last meeting, although we will have the option of a 7th meeting as has been offered to folks, I'm going to suggest at least a couple things that may help us try to give us our best shot at doing that. I'll come to this in a moment, but one of the regular ground rules has been to make sure, share the air. People say their piece, but make sure they listen and give space for everyone. In this case, again, with your support, I'm going to ask folks to maybe be a bit briefer so we can keep moving towards the goal of trying to complete our deliberations today. The second piece, again, with your support, that I would simply check in roughly at these time frames, 2:10, 2:30. How's the discussion going? How close are people thinking of finishing their advice to the Secretary? Are there loose ends that really need more attention beyond that? So share the air, focusing on maybe briefer comments and just my summary time checks of where we are at those time periods. Is that okay as we look around for trying to make this meeting as effective as possible? Okay. Next, please, just for who and where and why. I didn't touch anything. There we go. Okay, so the roles are the people around the table primarily to have the discussion with the Secretary. We have staff liaisons to help for certain parts of the presentation. And similarly from the Mercator and RS&H team for providing key information this way. And I'll be your flashing facilitator, I guess, depending on how this goes along. Let's see if the next slide gets it better for us.
Adam meant to find somebody, I look like the person.
Okay, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the share the air, maybe asking folks to be a bit briefer. Listen to others, focus on interests, seeking common ground, and we've covered the other ones before, so I think we can go to the next one. And so in front of you, as usual, a printed agenda. And so let me just step through that very briefly. In a moment, I will turn it over to a few of the presenters from both NCDOT and RS&H for catching up on information. Part of that had been emailed in advance, and other parts, including 2 rather detailed grids of information, will be part of what's in front of you. Then we return to where we left off at the last meeting for moving into those options, specifically reviewing option F, the complete and delete one, to create your views of the pros and cons and advice from the Secretary on that. Approximately 1:45, we'll move to looking across all the options. Last time you saw a general piece, and we've developed that further based on your input about what factors you want to have and sort of a quick side-by-side comparison. And then one piece I wanted to show that we wanted to make sure we're not cutting off discussion prematurely is in the 1:45 slot that will show you how, at least there's a summary of how to briefly look and compare the various options. And before moving to the review of the pros and cons, we've collected all your comments and we're able to then look at it option by option with the pros and cons. You may or may not want to come up with a new option or a combination of options for how things would work. So that's just a small addition to the agenda. Yes, please come on in. Let me get my stuff out of the way. So let me see if people have their materials, including the grids, which will be part of the information, the presentation today. And are there other questions? We are going to try to finish today, but there has been an inquiry to the advisory group members about the potential for April 30th if we cannot finish today. But I'm going to do my best to try to help people. Other questions before I turn it over for the information presentations?
Go ahead, advance it. Rada. So we're having a little bit of a technical difficulty. If you have your slides, your copies, it's slide number 6. It's the information requested at previous meetings. Just want to give an update on that. So the first 3 items, I believe Carly sent out an email regarding the allowable different express lanes around the country that allowed for prohibited trucks. So we sent out a table of that information. I don't know if everybody had a chance to review that or if they have questions on that. We also sent out some information on the hot lanes. As far as the NEPA analysis, Carly, you sent that out as well, right? And of course the table from the that we had handed out before regarding the truck percentages out there on I-77, the different length vehicles. As far as requests that we want to address for this meeting, there's an issue on the corridor cap and bonus allocation, and Secretary Trogdon, are you able to give an update on those?
Yes. On the corridor cap and bonus allocation, I think there were really 2 requests. One was we've started working with the Attorney General's office, so they're looking at what they need to do a review. We don't have a timeline yet, but as soon as I get that timeline that will take that review, we'll pass that on to the group. The second was that same question. We asked the General Assembly Transportation co-chairs of Transportation Oversight. Here's what our current policy and how DOT is implementing it. Tell us if we're reading this incorrectly. So it's trying to get at what is the legislature's intent. Because if we're misinterpreting that, we want to change it. But then also, if they don't understand the implications, is there something they want to address? So that leaves both options open.
Jimmy, can you tell us what they told you? I mean, what
They just got the request. I haven't seen a single response yet, but I anticipate they'll ask questions first, so they'll know what they're addressing.
Okay. I mean, obviously that has some impact, on a lot of what we do here, and that's why it's important to figure that out.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned they just got the request. Was there, I guess I wondered why they didn't get it sooner.
It took us about a week to get everything drafted, go through the language, pull it out. Then I was out of the office a couple of days, so by the time I could get back and sign it, those typical kinds of things.
Thank you for clarifying.
Next item was the quality of construction. Deputy Chief Mitchell, do you have an update on that?
So yeah, when you look at our comprehensive approach to quality in this project, the developer has a quality control program, and we have a layer program on top of it. The developer has a company by the name of PSI with approximately 31 inspectors. We have a company that's looking at quality assurance and verification for us, NCDOT does. And that's RKK, there are about 13 inspectors. And then the owner themselves, I-77 Mobility Office, have about 8 total. So about 52 personnel looking at quality. We've tested the developers on above and beyond the test requirements. When you look at our assurances, most of ours are double insurance in the neighborhood of about 30%. And I have a detailed breakdown that I can share with you all that highlights the testing and what we've done to confirm and reassure.
So is it fair to say that the road that is being built today is as good or better construction than the road that NCOD builds across the state?
I wouldn't say it's better. I would say they're meeting the requirements of the state and federal as far as testing in sampling.
Okay, so if it's not as better, it's as good. So
Yes, sir, it is.
Well, it's built to the same standard, right? It's built to AASHTO standards, right? But
But
what
they're
it's
building to a
built-
lesser standard for
Well, what it's built for, right, it's not built to handle, 50,000-pound trucks.
It's not built at a lesser standard, it's built at a lesser requirement.
There you go.
It's meeting the
Yeah.
quality requirement.
Yeah, and I understand, I recognize we did not build those 2 lanes for truck traffic. However, I think my question in asking this is, you know, I mean, I won't hide anything. There's plenty of stuff out there where Centra has had some quality problems around the world, or around the country, and I just wanted to make sure that that was not proliferated here on our project.
All right, the next item we were reporting on was, Jim was looking at some research on toll roads between public and private.
Excuse me, before we get to that,
Sure.
can I ask one question? I apologize. Okay, when we talked about the different standards, things built to a certain requirement. Are any roads that are built to a lesser requirement than this? Are there just 2 requirements?
So I would say a lesser requirement. When we look at our pavements, we design our pavements for vehicular traffic, and truck concentration is one of the chief variables when we're designing. And so when this project was advertised, and we were in the draft period, the requirement was not to design for heavy truck traffic in the HOT lanes. Now, our existing lanes are built to accommodate heavy truck traffic.
So are those the only two different kinds that you have? One that, like, I think in the city of Charlotte, on 77, it is designed, or will be designed to accommodate trucks. Is there anything else besides those 2? So,
I can jump in.
okay, again, I'm sorry, I'm not.
Commissioner, and I'm referring back to many years as a pavement engineer. So every road that we have in North Carolina, we design to what we anticipate the traffic to be. Lewis is exactly correct. The hot lanes were not designed for heavy trucks. They were designed only for, 2-axle, as you know, lighter duty vehicle. So you can think of light duty vehicles. We do the same thing across the state on all. The exception is these are restricted. So it's the first time we built restricted lanes, but we have some of the similar challenges in other facilities. If we don't estimate the number of traffic over a 30-year period correctly, we can have pavements that aren't quite as robust as we need them to be once we get them open. So it's something that we focus on every day. This is just different in that, this one does not allow heavy trucks in it. So it's designed just for the anticipated vehicles that are allowed. The way I always simplified it when I was a pavement engineer was we designed the depth of the pavements for trucks. We designed the widths for cars because the traffic volumes are typically determined by cars. So the number of lanes are typically driven by the number of cars, and the depth and thickness is by the truck traffic. Does that answer your question?
It doesn't.
So it's not really as simple as one or the other. Almost every one of
I'm
these.
just thinking, because we are bordered by 2 different states, that truck traffic, and because we have a new.
They pretty much use the same process
Right,
as we do.
so, I know, so the idea that it's okay, up here to be not as you say, robust, but in Charlotte, it's different, but it's probably the same vehicle, the same truck that's driving. So it still doesn't, it's still a problem for me. I've always had a hard time accepting that it wasn't as deep. But anyway, I accept what you're saying.
For the
about
project's concept, when it was advertised, it was very appropriate. I think your point is, looking at these options that we're looking at, does that create challenges? And the answer is yes, it does.
I guess my last question is, was that decision years ago incorrect? To me, it sounded like it was incorrect.
Based on what they were advertising, designing for, the answer is it was correct. Based on what we're looking at today, it creates limitations.
Right, isn't that their job to think about the future?
That's all of our jobs.
From the original concept that you did not want large trucks in these lanes? I mean, I understand there's a preference by some to say you want large trucks, but there's some folks who are not driving in lanes with trucks. That's where some lanes in the state have prohibited prohibition against trucks in these lanes. They're not.
It gets back to the last meeting when I was talking about, today, if we were designing these for large trucks, it would be a different project, because for us to make sure we had adequate safety, they'd be barrier separated. You'd have fewer access points, because when you mix traffic, as everyone knows, 80,000 pounds running at 70 miles an hour doesn't have the same stopping distance as, 6,000 pounds. So what would, if we were designing it for mixed traffic, it would look different.
And was that a spec put out by us, by NCDOT, or did Century come forward with that?
The decision to exclude trucks from managed lanes was DOT's decision, and therefore the design needed to spit.
That was the spec. Thank you.
While we're on the topic of trucks, some great information is being compiled on the truck volume here. I just want to call people's attention to it. Between exit 28 and exit 30, 40% of the traffic, if you look at that, 40%, if I'm reading this right, is basically vehicles 18 feet and over. So you got 60% cars, 40% trucks. Huge volume.
And taking it one step further, Mr. Hand, I heard your comments earlier about in large urban areas in this country, truck traffic travels off hours.
Well, they travel through here off hours, because they know they can be sitting if they don't.
Yeah, which I think is true of most large cities.
It's not as bad. If you look over to the southeast side, and I've tried to do a little work on that, this is probably twice as many trucks traveling all hours through here than they're normal.
Well, it's just the data shows otherwise, because it's showing 28%, it's basically showing the same ratios, because it has it by hours here. So in fact, you actually have greater truck traffic, looks like during peak hours in the morning, than you do during other times of the day.
Yeah,
Hang on, let me-
These are delivery trucks for local. These are freight through, this is freight on the other side, 61 feet.
These will also pick up trailers too, and boats and that type of stuff.
But you've got trucks that have got to deliver during certain work hours. They're smaller. They're smaller trucks. Your larger trucks that are actually going to haul your freight, that are trying to move something, if you've got a distribution point, they're going at different times.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I'm sorry, so people have already gone to the grid. Let's see who we have who wants to help people walk through what Mr. Nas and others are talking about. Is that you, Phil? I'm sorry?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what they're talking about, other than there is a high percentage of the length 18 to 35. And so they're just looking at the different percentages. And like I said, those will pick up boat trailers and that type of stuff in the lengths as well.
So here's what you're finding. So basically,
I think the point is, Commissioner Coughlin's point is well made, and Mr. Secretary, might be something to consider is, by building it the way that we did and by speccing it the way that we did, we limit future flexibility. And in this world of dynamic change in technology and how we live and work and automation of cars, it seems like it would have been fortuitous if we had built more flexibility, and we didn't, so we got to deal with that.
But this is a common challenge for express lanes, because typically you're not looking to put heavy trucks in express lanes. You want it to be a convenient trip for the driver, reliable travel time. So owners do have to go through a struggle of whether they spend extra money to design it for trucks and never put trucks in.
Actually, I hate to belabor the point, but if you do the arithmetic as far as the number of trucks, the big trucks, it's about the same. While the percentage is different, say at 1 o'clock in the morning, right now I have 370 vehicles. Take 7 o'clock, you've got 10 times that number of vehicles. So you got half of 170 is what?
The makeup of the traffic is significantly different, but that number of trucks doesn't change.
The number of cars change dramatically. The number of trucks looks like doesn't change much. Big trucks is kind of what a 30,000 foot view is. So they're there.
Well, because there's a lot of cities in North Carolina and also, I guess, in the United States that have where you're limited. And you've got to be in the right 2 lanes or 1 right lane or whatever. So not having them necessarily being able to be in the express lanes wouldn't be so different from a lot of other cities. The only problem is, in case of a record, you can't run on them. not gonna be any time you can be on them in any situation, whatever. If we decide to fix the 2 lanes that are regular, not toll, and you start running trucks for any amount of time, it will beat that lane up. That's gonna be the problem. There's no way they're gonna be able to do maintenance hardly on the existing lanes and use the toll at any toll lanes to get trucks around, because they won't hold up, we'll be working on them all the time. So it's kind of stuck in there, that's the biggest problem I see.
And Jeff, to your point, did we not talk about that before, that say these roads were built to last 20 years with cars? Can the DOT make a statement of how long would they last? And again,
That's what we're working towards. That's part of the
Then
request.
before we leave that, just so we make sure we keep everything in context, because when we talk about other cities, et cetera, I would tell you the number of other major metro cities that have added 0 capacity in the last 40 years for freight and are planning not to add any additional capacity for the next 50 years is a subset of about 1, meaning us. So the notion that there are other people who are not using express lanes doesn't note that, for example, in Winston-Salem, there is Business 40 and Interstate I-40. There is in Greensboro, Business 85, Interstate I-85. Atlanta, Raleigh, you bypass the main interstate, so you are in fact not placing trucks in the controlled access lanes because they have an entirely different way to get through the area. In this area, this is it. So you continue to have, and as the Secretary said, whoever decided this was the right way to go in the beginning, you have to recognize you have added no capacity since the road was built, and you have absolutely no capacity 50 years forward as it is now, regardless of how you use it.
Before going to Mr. Curran, ladies and gentlemen, wanted to remind us we're going to take our best shot at finishing. This is an important topic, especially in terms of what can and can't be used for the lanes for everybody's interests. But we're trying to make sure you have information so we can work through the options that consider all of these dimensions.
Jim, you and I talked about this before. Mr. Taylor, does the contract have mechanisms that allow for increases in capacity over the next 50 years?
Right. Doesn't prohibit increases in capacity, it provides for compensation under certain circumstances. So, to be fair, you can build capacity, and that's one of the reasons you're going through this exercise, to see if that's important enough to justify the cost.
So at the inception of the contract, there was a contemplation that capacity could be added over the next 50 years.
Right.
It's
In all
not that you're
contracts.
gonna build this and you're going to put it away for 50 years.
Very fair.
Are we ready for our next?
But we do have to, as we talk about the cost in and out, understand that that is a cost.
Yeah,
part of it.
and that may be fair, but it's not practical. Come on, I mean, we're saying we have to build toll lanes in the first place because we didn't have the money. And then we're saying we're gonna widen it, we can widen it sometime in the future and pay for umpteen decades of potential lost toll revenues is not exactly
well,
realistic.
and realistically, are we not working 15 years ahead right now under CRTPO? And if we were thinking about expanding it, why is there no dollars allocated and looking at the projects of, hey, we're gonna need capacity on I-77. So I think that just falls flat, because if that was truly the intent, then we would be working on that now for 10 years down the road, if not 15 years.
Further to the point, CRTPO put a project in to widen I-77 with general purpose lanes from exit 36 to Statesville. So that is in the long range plan.
So there's nothing that precludes submitting that project. Nothing that precludes. We talked about the meetings, we talked about the ability to do that. There's nothing that precludes it. And the purpose of the toll lanes wasn't simply revenue. It was reliable travel time and managed land.
I'm going to
disagree.
Yeah,
okay.
Actually, that was the only problem. I agree with that.
It's not in the statutes, it wasn't in the STI law, it wasn't in the P3 law. P3 law says it
The
was.
fast lane study, it was
That's
precisely what motivated.
Excuse me, gentlemen. I know this is important.
It's funny.
And
At some point, we got to be able to communicate so that get to work through this.
Hold on. We're jumping from information you requested to try to present it as appropriately as possible, so then you can use it for discussing the pros and cons of the options. Is that something we think we can do at this point? To finish the information and then go? No? You want to go for a different agenda?
No.
So you're saying we would move back around to this?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ms. Cotham.
However, again, this is part of the emotion and the frustration, and we're angry. This was a screw up. This part was a screw up. We can all use all kinds of nice words, but let's just be real. This was a screw up, and North Mecklenburg, they're taking the brunt of this. And no one has ever says, we're sorry, we messed up. You can say it's all about the criteria and everything, but we know the deal. Kurt knows the deal. Puckett knows the deal. We know the deal. So it's just, sometimes we just have to be able to say that.
Okay.
And just accept, and it's important that you all know that that the people that, I know people here that are citizens, there's people watching, and this is a big frustration. We got the short end of the stick up here in North Mecklenburg. Again, this is Main Street. Even comparing these, I just remind you, and I appreciate you being here, I appreciate you doing this, I'm glad the governor, allowed this to happen, but we just do need to remind you that comparing us to other roads, this is very different. This is Main Street. This is Main Street up here, and it's just, this affects these people every day. And they're frustrated, they're mad about it. I'm mad about it. So that's why it's hard to just kind of go over this subject without getting mad, because we are mad. So anyway, I mean, this is our meeting. This is our meeting, and I just think, I appreciate you wanting to keep us on. If we have to have another meeting, we do. But it's good that we're talking.
Well, and the danger, and I'll stop, because the danger of comparing it to this and other cities is, show me another city where there's this much congestion and 0 parallel roads. We got a lake and we got 115. We have 0 parallel roads, and I would guarantee that is unique in the United States. And I would challenge anybody to find me something where there's this level of congestion and this level of lack of north-south connectivity.
Well, in other areas where toll lanes have been put in, toll lanes are put in as a last resort. So, like I-15 in San Diego was a 4-lane freeway, and then they widened it to 10 lanes, and then it was 12 lanes, and they didn't have any more space, and they had these express lanes, there's HOV lanes going down the middle of it, and they said, okay, let's sell that extra capacity and make that into a toll lane. It's been a last resort, whereas here, this was used as a first resort. And I think to your point, John, that's the part of what stems from the frustration.
And I think that perhaps part of this conversation, the direction we're going in, to Ned's point, we're not happy about the roads. We're going to work through what our options are about the roads, but we need your help in figuring out what we're going to do with the toll roads. We got toll roads, but we need more roads. So I sat on CRTPO for 4 years, consistently brought up, you took 21 when you built 77, you never finished 21. We're now talking about widening 21 all the way to Charlotte from exit 28. It's a dead end at exit 28, and then it funnels through Davidson. One road, Main Street, Davidson, 20 miles an hour, with pedestrians, cars, dead people, dead dogs. Main Street, Davidson, Highway 115, Highway 21, and Highway 77. And that's unacceptable. So we need, if we're going to have the tolls, we're going to have the tolls. But what we need is beyond 2 voices sitting at the table at CRTPO trying to convince the rest of the county that we have problems.
Without the votes.
We need NCDOT, because CRTPO is not going to vote for us. We need NCDOT to get involved and say, we're going to build some roads. This is what we need to do. Damn the rest of the county, damn the rest of the state, we owe it to these people. And at least that's the way we feel. It may not be the way the rest of the state feels, but I think you all being here and the governor recognizes that there are real problems, which we appreciate.
I think the problem is it was a horrible contract, but then to put on top of it that you couldn't have competing roads, pretty much shut down everybody else. We can't compete, so we're not going to even look about doing any roads.
But you can't compete.
I mean, that's not the premise.
We said at the very beginning, we're going to lie on facts. It is not correct that you can't build compete roads.
You can, you have to pay to play, but.
Yeah, yeah.
You only pay if you're doing improvements inside 77.
Right.
I think.
Things on other roads.
Right.
Perhaps.
You can build a parallel road.
Hold on, one at a time, please. I'm sorry.
We know that.
So when you talk about capacity, great, but capacity is south of Charlotte. How you get north? Unless you're gonna go a whole big road across that road.
Well, that's
Right.
And that's what she's talking about.
So you can under the contract, but
Well,
you gotta buy some dry land to do
the
it.
truth of the matter is, along with this contract was more than this contract. It took away our last best chance for some decent roads. I mean, by i.e. giving away all the right of way, right? So yeah, we can build roads. I acquiesce. Yes, Ned, we can build roads. The problem is we now have to pay an extra 100 million or whatever the compensating event would be in order to then start getting the roads, which then moves us down on the TIP and the whole transportation improvement process, that whole voting scheme, which further disadvantages us.
And I think that's a hard pill to swallow as well as the timing of everything. So even if we do get something in the CRTPO, we all walk out of here today with a new plan, that's still 15 to 20 years away, and that's awfully difficult to handle as well. So we just need help beyond figuring out the toll situation, which is what we're here for. We need help moving traffic.
And I think we had an excellent discussion last meeting about, there's a lot of things in option D, and I believe that's exactly what you're talking about. So moving forward, how do we really explore that option D? What are the right answers? Where are the shortcomings? And then what are some of the strategies to get around those?
Agreed. Just to round out the truck and the pavement design, I know we had looked at the design and it definitely didn't include the heavy trucks. So if you were to put heavy trucks on it, it would fail in no time. So it's really not an option unless you reconstruct the entire pavement with something stronger.
So we did, we did look at that. The contract specifies the traffic that they have to design for in the hot lanes. But we also put in a minimum thickness. So regardless of what the design shows, they have to have this minimum thickness. So we looked at that thickness, our pavement engineers looked at that thickness and analyzed how long it would last. With one conservative assumption and then two different scenarios. The conservative assumption was that half of the trucks would be using air filters. Typically, the trucks are in the rightmost lane or lane next to that. But if we assume half the trucks use these lanes, how long would that pavement last? The two scenarios for heavy trucks, the tractor trailers, and then the medium duty trucks, these would be your FedEx delivery trucks and so forth. Under the medium duty trucks only, and that's one of the options that we can consider, it's made out fully. Our service life, that is the life of the pavement without a major rehabilitation. We would expect to do minor rehabilitation every 8 to 12 years on any pavement. But major rehabilitation, we would hope to go 30 years typically. With the dual trucks, the medium trucks on the lanes, that's reduced to 25 years in the areas where we have really good soil. There are portions of the project that have poor soils, so that could be down closer to 10 years in the areas where we have poor soils. So those would be the areas that we have to watch out for. But there's really not that much reduction in service life, just allowing those medium duty trucks. The heavy trucks, as Phil stated, it's not the one truck, it's the repeat use rate, so that happens quickly. That can be anywhere from 2 to 6 or 8 years before the pavement starts to fail in the heavy duty trucks. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more specificity.
So the summary is the medium, it would be somewhere between 20 and 25 years. And the heavy trucks, it would be somewhere between 2 to 7.
2 to 6, 2 to 7.
Is the life.
Significant.
Yes.
One other item was some investigation Jim was doing on public tolling versus private tolling.
Staff's been diligent about following your questions. Most of them were requests for data, and we didn't know exactly how you wanted to use it. This was the opposite. At the end of meeting 4, Mr. Curran asked if we could quantify the difference between a private operation and a public operation in terms of toll rates. I had mentioned earlier in the meeting that I didn't think the Virginia toll lanes are a good example. They're apples and oranges. There are publicly operated toll roads there, but they only toll during the peak hour in the peak direction, and they allow HOV2 as compared to the private, which toll all the time and have HOV3. But I suggested perhaps the 91 express lanes in California might be a good example, because for the first 7 years it was owned by a private developer, and then for the last 15 years it's been a public operator. We looked at the data and it's inconclusive, in large part because of the apples and oranges thing. Under the private operator, they told HOV3 half of whatever they told everybody else. The other difference is the 91 express lanes is not dynamic pricing. Both the private and the public operator post a schedule that varies by day, by hour, but they don't change it based upon traffic. So the public operator, as soon as they took over the road, and it was a mutual friendly negotiation, it wasn't a forced takeover, but as soon as they did, they raised toll rates, which makes you think, why is the public doing that? Then they made HOV free, electric vehicles free, handicap free, and that makes sense. Most of the public operations want people throughput, not vehicle throughput. And so they wanted to encourage HOV free, so they didn't start charging SOV higher. I tried to find some other examples, and it all comes down to the policy. So while it would be nice to have a rule of thumb, toll rates would be lower, it's also important to recognize that on these facilities, the reliable travel time is the goal, not to put as many people through. And so that's why the highest toll rates are on the VDOT owned one at $40, because they wanted to have HOV and everybody else get through, not SOV. So the report back to the group is there's no easy rule of thumb, and that you shouldn't expect necessarily that toll rates would be lower with a public operator, but they may fulfill other public policy goals, such as allowing more HOV.
A couple other items that were under progress. One was the bonus allocation monies, exactly the completion dates of some projects. We have provided a table that the projects that were under construction, we did have a completion date in there. There is an update for one of the projects as far as when it's anticipated to start. So we're going to send out an update of the table, but for the projects that are still in planning and design, we don't have estimated completion dates of it, just the fiscal year that construction is supposed to be led. So we'll send out an update of that one shortly. And then Rod, do you have information on the STI hypothetical?
We are working on that, and that's the process, I believe. We talked about it before, so that is, the request has been submitted and it's going through the process. I don't know if we have an exact timeline when we will have that information back, but I do know that they are working on that. That's all.
Would that not change your STI based on what it looks like? I mean, to me, that's just for determination options.
Okay, so right now, when we go to the option F, you will see that slide. On option F, so right now what they are ranking today is what they call round 5, what they call P5.0, and that started about a year ago. So that's kind of already at the towards end of the process. What we assume for any of these options is we are basically, we'll be able to fit it into the beginning of the next round, which I believe starts probably early next year or spring next year. So that's the assumption we made, so it should not make any change in that. However, if you remember, again, when we go to option F, you will see that we said the TIP 10-year period is anywhere from 2022 to 2031, and we don't know exactly when it will be funded in the time frame. But if your question is that beginning year 2022 change with that? No, because we assume that's what the options are going to be analyzed.
All the schedule assumptions are optimistically assuming it ranks and it'll start in that process.
Absolutely.
So let me just add something. So if you go to CRTVO's website or we continue link, we actually have the first cut, the draft of what 5.0 scoring will look like on a statewide basis. So to your question, would that affect that? When you go back and look at the STI law, there is a set amount of money for the statewide level a set of money for the regional set for the division. So yes, if the project did rank well enough, it would change something that's lower in priority on the list.
Well, and I guess the question, the reason I asked that is I think we're gonna have different options come out today, and depending on what we say this option, you might have 3 or 4 different rankings, ranking this, and if with this option, we'd rank this, and they may have different ranking scores.
And we can
Yes.
do that.
And different versions of options.
Right.
Can we derive that once we get into the
Yes.
discussion?
Yes.
Because that'll be a big driver.
It's also assuming that you do not have the opportunity legislatively to put out of SDI and deal with it as a unique situation.
Which is why I would put that
Legislature makes the law, legislature can change it. It's kind of that optional capacity.
So everybody's seen this quite a bit. This is just the summary of the different options, so it's all on one page. But today we want to go through option F, which was the last one on the report. And again, this is also termed the complete delete option, where you allow the developer to complete the construction, and then you ultimately terminate the contract, modify it to remove the tolling equipment. One item we had talked about was whether you keep it as an express lane that's not tolled or not, meaning you're gonna have some buffers that are painted in there. In the south section that's separated, it'll have to remain separated for some time. So those are items that we want to make sure, if everyone's in agreement of what this should actually be from a scope standpoint, we want to make sure that we have that correct, or if there's some spin-offs that John's going to help everybody walk through, that we know exactly what we should be looking at and what the group is looking at as far as what type of input we want to provide for this. And again, NCDOT would be maintaining it and operating the facility. And I think that's it for that. Let's go to the next slide. So from an impacts, you saw the fair market value had a range to it. And if we are allowing it to complete within the current scope, if we had to go in and remove tolling equipment or some of those buffers, restripe it and that type of stuff, there could be additional cost from a design and construction standpoint. Now again, this is fair market value. This is not the full termination amount. There's some additional allowable amounts that will be added, demobilization, that type of thing, to this dollar figure. And again, the fair market value of senior debt, the fair market value is determined by an independent appraiser. And then the additional stuff will be negotiated between NCDOT and the concessionaire.
So I gotta talk about this fair market value. Do we have that, can we get that chart up? You could, do we have a pointer?
I don't know this one. Yep, it is. It'll take me a minute. Got that? 1 second, but if you would.
This here again, we have cameras rolling, and we have numbers of 392 million to 623 million, and we need to make sure we have a pretty solid understanding of where those numbers are coming from and how they're derived. I'm not sure I do, but I know I think where they should be, so. There you go. Yeah, if we can make that bigger.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So, so if we look here, we have kind of two different shades of series of graphs. We have these kind of pink ones or whatever color that is there. Those are the number of transactions over the course of the contract. All right, and so this dotted line here, that's what Cintra, they call the developers, estimate of the transaction is. And what happens is the bank does a scenario and they say, well, we took a look at that and we decided maybe some things are a little bit optimistic, so here's what we think are going to be the number of transactions. And these are the number of transactions here. And then they have what they call, so that's the lender's base case. And they have the lender's downside case, which you see this little big line here. not so much concerned about the number of transactions when we talk about a fair market value as we are the dollars. And so that's what these blue lines are here, are the dollars. And so these are basically annual revenues. And notice these are $2012, okay? So these are not current year or then year dollars, these are actual $2012. And again, we have the blue dotted blue line here, and this is Citrus numbers, which this is what I believe was used to get the fair market value of those revenue projections, is that right? Those are the CNM numbers?
We started out as a base, so we did 50% higher and 50% lower.
Right. So let's talk about this number for a minute. So if you look, you can say kind of an average, which would be right about here, sort of average, that's about $90 million. To date, and those are $2012, to date, no toll lane in the United States of America has ever had annual revenues of $90 million. Now, North Carolina Expressway will probably do that this year. Capital Expressway is getting close, so is the I-95 Expressway. But no private toll lane has ever averaged or ever actually exceeded $90 million. You look at the North Carolina Expressway, Dallas, metropolitan population 7 million. Capital Beltway, I-495, metropolitan population 5 million. You look at I-77, Lake Norman, 150,000. So when we start to look at that, we say, you know, this is just, this should not be, I'm trying to be circumspect here, the state's position of what we're presenting, what we're going to base our fair market value off of. This is like going to, you're trying to buy a house, and to figure out how much you pay for the house, you go to the seller and ask, how much should I pay for it? That's what that number is, and that's what we're using. If I take this number, notice this is about half, all right? And then the lender's downside case is about a third. My position is, and what I throw out to the group is, banks don't lend based on what they think is going to happen. Banks lend on kind of a worst case scenario. This should be the revenue projections that the state of North Carolina uses to come up with the fair market valuation. And if you do that, and I took a stab at it, guess what? You come up with a negative fair market value, which tells you the project will probably go bankrupt, which probably comes as a surprise to no one given the history of this company. So and not only are we saying that this is our nominal case, but we're saying, you know what, the upside case is 50% higher than that.
Okay, are you done?
So I'm done with my diatribe.
The purpose of this group is to help the secretary figure out where to go next. You guys wanted to know a range of what the fair market value could be, so we gave you an example based on public information. This, we gave you the chapter. I have the abbreviations that Mr. Puckett wants it. This was to show that the debt could be repaid under this downside case, and it was not intended to say this is what the state should do. I thought I made it clear at the last meeting, but I'll state it again. I am not giving you an appraisal. What I'm telling you is this is how the process works. The independent appraiser, if we get to that step, may want to sit down with Mr. Noss and say, I agree with you. I'm completely throwing out why all these people invested $600 million of equity, and I'm only going to focus on the downside. But that's the next step in the process. So you guys are all free to say, Mr. Noss is right, we won't have to pay anything to terminate this. It'll be zero, it'll be whatever.
No,
but you won't know for sure until you do the independent. So one thing to walk away, the state is not saying anything about what the termination clause is. It was an example in the Mercator
That's where I
report.
disagree, because you have this evaluation matrix here, and you have potential cost impacts, $392 million to $622 million.
I think that's fair then, when you go
put
through
this
the
in front
pros and cons.
Excuse me, let me finish my thought, please.
Yeah.
You put this in front of the legislator, and he's going to say, oh crap, I'm not going to spend $623 million. So if these are just illustrative numbers, then we should not be representing them as potential cost impact on a presentation given by and on behalf of the North Carolina Department of Transportation.
What would you suggest? This wasn't for the legislature, by the way.
Well, yeah, and
what would you suggest we use for the number?
My numbers, which is basically you're somewhere between 0 and the senior outstanding debt.
But you know what? I think that's fine.
Put a TBD there if you want. And you can tell I'm reacting rather strongly to the fact that we're representing that this is, you know, $600 million. I get it, you were very clear, you know, in explaining it, but then I came back and I saw this chart, and, you know, if this gets passed around.
Right, no, I mean, the chart was not intended to be passed around and given to the legislature. So one of the committee members has suggested that this chart be deleted or TBD. That's within your power. You know, as I've said many times, the number it is does not seem to change anybody's opinion, but you're concerned about how this will be marketed. What's the next step? These are your charts. This is for you to understand things. So I think it's perfectly valid for you guys to say, Mr. Secretary, here's our pros and cons. We think this is a pro, but we don't think you should consider the range that Mercator provided. We think our own assessment of 0 to 289 is more appropriate for you to use.
Okay, Mr. Hedworth and Mr. Curran, we'll see
Jim,
some
I
other
have
voices
utmost
on this
respect for
point.
the work that you've done, and I'm appreciative to have you on this team and working, okay? And I understand what you're saying. I think your points are very valid. The concern is, right, when we threw out the $350 million in that first meeting, what was on the news outlets the next morning? No, but it's a reality we must be aware of. What was on the news outlets that the legislators are watching, right? And so we got to be very careful that TBD is a lot better. And I, as an engineer, I'm an engineer myself, and you got to be really careful because we all engineers can make all the data say whatever we want it to say. Okay, and so we got to be careful that the first number that we're using to calculate is more than an assumption; it's an accurate number.
So, Carl, all due respect, I hear you, and you've offered an opinion, and people can choose that, and it sounds like you'd like to go that route. The range you selected was based on the public information as underwritten by investment bankers and the like. The debt was rated investment grade, indicating a relatively high in the scheme of debt, which did not contemplate the project would fail. On the contrary, it would be successful. And deposition in that regard. You have an opinion, and I can respect that opinion. But I don't think it's fair to condemn what you used, because what you used was a more traditional and candidly a more professional, with all due respect, professional underwriting approach made by people who actually underwrote the debt and stuck in
But Mr. Curran, this is exactly what I don't want to do. It's not a debate. You guys are supposed to be advising on next steps. And the next step, if you think will be different, if it's 0 to 289 versus this range, you communicate that to the secretary.
Fair enough. And I think now, I'll just to your point, Ned, and that is that it's the lender's base case. Okay, so it absolutely is those solid numbers and the lower numbers that they lent on, not Centris, that they decided the creditworthiness of the project.
Understand. They did not contemplate in that lowercase bankers.
I'm sure they did.
Right. But
So-
you
so
know,
hold
Ned,
on,
we'd be
hold on.
foolish not to look at the history of the
I
past.
said I did.
But
So, I'm sorry, two things. Hold on just a second, Mr. Edward. Other committee members, are there other questions you have about this diagram before we go back and continue other aspects of option F? Now, Mr.
And I'll just finish, my last point is, I think we'd be foolish not to consider that this particular company has a history of overstating their revenue and having a history of going bankrupt. Ned, I think that's the point is, hey, let's not fall, we've got some datum points. We've got some history. And overstating revenue and going bankrupt is not out of the ordinary or out of the realm of possibilities. And so it would be prudent to us to do that. And so when we see high numbers coming from Centra, well, of course, if I was Centra, I'd be putting out high numbers too, because that helps my bank case, that helps me sell it, that helps me sell my bonds. But that isn't necessarily what is the actual, and we have some actual history, so it'd be foolish for us to ignore that.
What's the timeline for that period that they went bankrupt?
7 to 10 years.
7 to 10 years on an average, consistent.
Yeah.
So you got to be out 7 to 10 years.
No, not consistently. That's unfair. 7 to 10 years, the ones that we've looked at, right?
The ones you've looked at.
Right, and
there's only so many.
More successful
And there was a recession, which made a lot of people have a tough time. But again, you guys need to focus on what is your recommendation going forward, not battling back and forth. That was the whole Mercator report, is to say there's so much arguing that nobody's focused on what is constructive that can be done on the next step.
Fair
So
enough.
I
accept that.
I accept
I accept
so I can make that analogy.
Right, and the problem is that, I respect you've done your research, but then to, in a public meeting in front of the camera, say all of their projects went bankrupt within 7 to 10 years, undermines everything we've been doing.
Yeah, agreed, and I'll take that back. We said all of them consistently. We've looked at minutes.
Focused on.
I'll pull that back.
An accurate statement has been no private toll lane has been under the original ownership for longer than 15 years. They've all either gone bankrupt, they've been bought by a municipality, or they've been sold, which is a different statement than they've all gone bankrupt.
Okay, so Mr. Puckett had been waiting, then Mr. Curran, and then I want to check for our quieter voices, given how important this part of option F is.
Well, I was hoping to be in the quieter voice.
One, there's a reason we're laughing.
Kurt made a statement that as a fact that none have proceeded to the entire contract. Is that a fact that he may knows of or not?
That is not correct. And it's the nature of the business. Certain people are developers and they sell out. It's not necessarily the expectation that they will stay in for 50 years.
Okay. So, fair enough. Okay. To me, and I completely get it, and I don't want to get hung up on this, by the same token, when I talk about this being a singularly unique, which I think is singularly unique, self-evident. And as we look towards getting out of this particular predicament, I think you have to start to argue it as a unique situation that you then do have to start to look at legislative, and there are any number of legislators who I talked to one today, looking at how you manage through that process. So they do start to look at the cost of it. I think there is the opportunity to kind of go, this is one that wasn't produced under SDI, perhaps we need to look at how we get out of it, outside of SDI. And for me, to listen to both Kurt and Jim, I would say the range is not 392 to 623, it's 0 to 623, which is to argue that nobody has any real idea other than it could be wonderful or it could be $623 million. So, because I think you could make the argument either way. And so to kind of say, hey, the bottom line is 392, unless somebody in this room wants to tell me it's absolutely positively not going to be less than 392, I think that, then we're just truth is we're dealing with whatever someone determines fair market value to be. And that is assuming that as you negotiate a contract, they stick to the original contract and aren't willing to alter that in negotiation also.
But it should be, there should be the greater fair market value or senior outstanding.
That's correct. So the minimum, would you agree, would be 289 million? Okay.
Fair enough.
So that helps you guys to have a floor. You pay off the senior debt. And now the next step is, where do you go from there? There you go.
Okay, Mr. Curran.
I was going to a real estate deal because you talked about inflated revenue to get the deal, we can get the business. Total project cost on this project is
600 something.
Centra's actual cash there, not debt, not the state's portion, not the bondholders, not cash, Centra and their equity investment.
We'll put in, I don't know at the moment, but we'll put in over 200.
Over 200 million. And so their cash infusion relative to other private toll ventures in the country, debt to equity ratio is conservative, meaning they're putting a lot more cash in another deal, a relative basis.
It's consistent. They just won I-66 where they're putting even more equity. But that reflects the variability there. So I'm not sure where you're heading.
Where I'm heading is, if you look at the deals that were done prior to this deal, I think, and Roger, this is one of the greatest equity infusions on a relative scale. And that's because the deals that were done the decade before, pre the crash, were much more leveraged. It's an indication that they're putting a lot of skin in the game. My point being, their inducement to overstate things is minimal. You're talking about they're putting over $200 million into this.
And do we know how much they put in to date?
0. That's what we learned in the first year.
Their equity is committed.
Committed. I think that's important.
The fact that a dollar has not been expended, although there have been a few dollars expended.
Ms. Casher, we'll start to get into their cash based on public finance amount, approximately around June, July, based on work orders.
And all transactions are like that in the US, because as soon as their money goes in, it starts earning double digits. So you spend down all the money that is the cheapest before you start letting them build up double-digit returns, or at least having it. So that's not unusual to this contract to have the equity spent down last. But it is committed, they can't walk away.
So let me check. As one rightfully, starting with Mr. Nass's analysis, has concerns about how one puts figures on this. Where we came all the way around was, it's either fair market value or senior debt. We know what senior debt is. There's different opinions, or at least different information analysis offered about would fair market value be greater than that. And no one will know for sure until there's an independent appraisal. Are people ready to hear the other pieces on this option before I ask for your pros and cons?
Good, thanks.
So then we talk
Possible to turn the heat up? Pat's freezing. Well, the right side of Pat is warm. The gentle side of Pat is cool.
Get somebody checking on.
Thank you.
So then we'll go to the approvals. Just to remind you all, for all the options, we were looking at a set of approvals. There is the same set we are going to look at for this option too. This table is probably familiar. We basically looked at this table pretty much for every option so far. They go from going to CRTPO to revise the MTP list, or revise the MTP, or they revise our MNT project list. Then going to the STI, project prioritization, that we just talked about, and doing the air quality conformity determination, and doing the NEPA document, and finally getting all the approvals before the project or the modification could be implemented. For option F, the first thing is the MTP project list. As you remember, depending on which option, some options were yes to all these 5 factors, some were yes to only certain factors versus the other. This specific option, option F, then the first step is MTP project list has to revise because the scope we are looking at is different. The current scope in the MTP or the project list is 2 express lanes, or 2 lanes that provide the reliable travel time. By going to general purpose lanes, we are changing the scope, so it has to go to the MTP project list. Then could be submitted to STI, so it could be ranked, and then a funding timeline could be determined. Then you go to the air quality conformity. That is the process that CRTPO as well as NCDOT will work with several environmental agencies to get that process completed. And the significance of that is that process takes a long time. That's the reason why that is one specific process that talked a lot in projects of this magnitude. So you go through that process and then revise the document that was already completed previously, because we have a scope is different and the project purpose and need is different. So the document we have now would be reviewed, revised, and the approvals, whether it is other environmental agencies or regulatory agencies or FHWA, we need to review the document, approve the document, and provide the appropriate permits. The next slide talks about timeline, but before I go to that, any questions on this? Okay. So this is the same timeline again we looked at for most projects. We looked at basically from today, 2018, all the way to opening the project. And so if we decide this is the option moving forward, the first thing that happens is obviously construction has to be paused. So there are obviously steps that would need to be taken care of to make sure the construction area is safe in before pausing the construction, because we may be pausing the construction for several years, depending on when the funding is obtained.
No, wait, why are we pausing the construction? This was.
This is just completed.
Yeah, completed. That means the project is completed.
Yes. So right now,
And then we terminate the contract.
the option F, like you said, is complete and delete, and the way we analyze this, there is really no easy or straightforward way to let the contract go on, the construction continue if you're not building express lanes. If the intent is to build general purpose lanes, the construction basically has to be stopped, so you can get the approvals that we just talked about on the previous slide, and the construction has to stop. Because right now, the authorizations are to build the express lanes. Secretary, Mr. Secretary, you want to say
I
something?
would, to John and Kurt's point, this option is you complete the construction, they go ahead and demobilize all their equipment. During this time, the DOT, at one point, it's 12 months from now or so. So during that time, the DOT who started the process for all the environmental studies that need to be done, then they go ahead and sit down the day it opens, sit down with Center, terminate the contract. That termination is between $0 and the outstanding senior debt is what I would say on that. And then at that point, we decide what are we going to do next with the tollways, because this is a 28-mile project, but the vast majority of congestion is 7 miles, right? So what happens down south, well, at Bridgeworth and so forth, where over a third of the cost of this project is being done south of mile marker 17, I believe. Really, that doesn't handle our issues up here in the northern part of the county in South Ireland. So again, complete construction, DOT has started the process now to get the appropriate sign-offs and studies and so forth done. And then at that point, once you get control of lanes and stuff, then you start to implement some of those other things we talked about. And that is converting one of the toll lanes to GP, hardening the shoulders, maybe a free flyer program for folks that are using that. And then because the DOT is running this particular project, those toll revenues are used to pay for that $0 to $283 million to pay us off and other things. So I think that's what I see this as.
Yeah, I do have a response, but Mr. Secretary, you want to add something?
And we may be getting different options combined somehow, because I was reading option F as, complete the construction, try to work on the process of conversion, but we already knew what we were converting to, which would be 2 general purpose lanes. Now that would take some time, and the project may be open while you're doing that analysis, and then convert it sometime in the future. But not stop to wait for what you were going to build. That was option B. Option B was, terminate the project, do analysis, don't do anything until we figure out where we're going. This one, I think the option F was clearly, it's convert everything to general purpose lanes or restricted general purpose lanes.
Yeah, this is what you mentioned was
So,
more.
it may be that Paul's construction may not be the way it would be done.
Now, I could see, you have where you're reletting, and then you have some sort of modifications that you do to the project to make it, open it to general purpose lanes or whatever's decided there, so you have some time there. But as you're saying, parallel to that, the project can open. Right, and you could work on the approvals and all those necessary things. I'm just looking, I think we could take, a good year and a half, 2 years out of this.
I'd go ahead, but realizing there's some of these we could go back and reevaluate.
If I may, Mr. Secretary, the pause construction, in my mind, is the reality that if we
I think that, the thing that needs to happen today that this opens up is that there is a DOT takes over. The contract currently with a vendor is terminated, DOT takes over, at which point you now have control of the project, at which point you can go ahead and enact some of those changes. That's fine. You can make changes if you own it. If they still are operating under the original contract, I think that makes it a little more complicated.
Looks like the STI is the driver, because it says in order to obtain funds to pay for the termination, it has to meet the priority. So, we can talk about writing the check all we want, but we gotta get that piece done before we can, and then here it can stretch out to 2031. It depends on where we end up. That's why I want to know what's our chances in the queuing to be at the top of the queue.
I think at this point, one of the things we discussed with this project is because it is so unique, I think that there needs to be a unique approach. And this might, we go ahead and get legislative action so we bypass SDI to go ahead and make any changes that we can.
And documentation and approvals can affect your buyout price, because you find yourself in a much stronger position if you basically cancel this contract with anyone and not have it sit for 2 years while we get necessary approvals to make it used. So I think you could work those two in parallel.
Rhonda, why don't you finish the timeline, understanding those different views about how much or at all on the pause construction piece. Okay.
So if I just continue the, so then you basically go to the MTP, and we gave a timeline of about 6 months. So CITPO can define the parameters of the scope change, and that could be submitted to STI. And STI, the timeline shown is similar to what we showed last time. I give the same disclaimers. This assumes that the project is ranked high in the 2022 to 2031 time period, which is exactly what you one of you is saying as well. We don't know the reality, but that's what we assume. We are assuming that the project ranks pretty high. We'll be completing the environmental documentation about the same time, so that air quality conformity and FHWA permits could be completed, and then we could re-let the project as quick as possible related to the project getting funded and the fiscal year 22 or fiscal year 23 at that time. And then the construction open to traffic. So this is where we are currently opening the traffic. This option, the way our analysis is done, that's what the.
So when would we write a check for that, if we're in that scenario for the STI approval? When do you see us being able to write a check to pay them out?
Phil, please feel free to chime in, but again, we have not done any STI analysis or any hypothetical analysis on this yet. That's one of the questions you asked, and the SPOT office is looking into that. This option assumes that we have money to do whatever action needs to be done, whether it is construction or something else, basically the very first day of fiscal year 2023, basically July 1st, 2023. If that is not the case, and if the project is not ranked until, let's just say 27, 28, something like that, then obviously everything gets delayed.
Then they start the construction back up. Or if it's a finished product, they'll just go ahead and take it back over, because we got to go out to 2030, and that's a long time before we can write a check.
Yeah, I think in his schedule, basically, the blue box that says relet the project is the trigger for expenditure of money. So you gotta have the money lined up by that point. You'll know it somewhere around that Q3, Q2 of 2021, but you physically have to have the money available by Q2 of 2022.
Why is that 2031 in there? It keeps popping up my eyes.
I think that's his point about, this is saying, okay, if it scores really high, this would be an earliest date. If it doesn't score as high and other projects have to be built in front of it, then that pushes it out in that timeline.
Yeah.
So it really gets back to,
face that possibility.
it's really getting back to how it scores.
Then we go back to negotiate on the different terms.
So, just so I'm clear, then who operates it from 2018 when we paused construction to that point? It's still operated by Centra at that point?
Yes, under this scenario, unless you do pause construction, if you open a construction, Centra would operate it until you get this replacement prioritized and underway.
So they would operate in this case to 2022, basically? Am I hearing that? Am I reading that right?
Yes, and the optimals, if it scores really high, that would be the earliest date.
2022. But if it doesn't, it could be 2031.
Yes.
And maybe parts of the project.
Not under option F. I think we were looking at parts of the project under modification options.
Yeah, I think it's scoring.
Yes.
I think your probability of scoring would be perhaps increased if you broke it.
So as we've done with other options, can we at least gather the pros and cons? I know there's question marks along many options, including this one, but how do people see the pros and cons of option F?
We don't know where the scoring will be. That's the big.
That's important.
That's the problem.
The STI scoring, right? We don't know that. What else for pros or cons?
For the consistency, we would rely on CRTPO. That's been a con in the past.
And since the toll thing will be operating, and you're looking at appraiser or buyout, so you're looking at the revenue generated, it's a pro and con. You know, if we think what's gonna happen, few cars will use it, so the revenue projections will be low, or close to that, worst case scenario we have, or more people could use it, and then the cost would go up. So there's a lot of uncertainty with that revenue stream.
So I'm sorry, I want to make sure I got that on the both sides. There is revenue generated,
Correct.
but depending on the flow, that affects the buyout amount potentially for fair market value. Okay.
Based on the revenue, it can be either one.
Right, I mean,
Right.
the key thing
Could be
is
a
the
pro or a
uncertainty.
con.
The uncertainty.
Revenue's great as a con from a standpoint of buyout.
I hope someone will mention it, since you've been walking around the pro that many people's interest is.
We look at, you think that would be included, and I'm just trying to decide whether it's a separate con, because there's no known revenue source for this.
That's the
It
way
doesn't
I-
cost benefit, that's what they're comparing the source. Okay. The other thing is just, and Kurt asked last time if we had reduced congestion, and this statement is the best source, and Jim, to your point about, I mean, at some point, and I'm curious on the consultants, the notion of congestion and general purpose lanes, immediately, what does history tell us in terms of general purpose lanes and reduced demand and those types of things?
Mr. Moss didn't say we'll ease congestion forever, he just said reduce congestion, so I think that's.
So I think that's pertinent to the evaluation of this.
Well, it's pertinent in as much as if you will agree that it works both ways. So if you keep it as it currently is, the two general purpose lanes will increase in congestion. I would argue exponentially. So if you double the capacity, eventually it will fill up. If you triple the capacity, eventually it will fill up. If you restrict it to what is currently there, it will fill up faster. And those general purpose lanes. So it is consistent, to your point, when we become 2 million people in this area, it will be full.
It's pertinent to the extent that it applies to every other road widening project in the state.
Yeah.
Yeah, if our logic of we're gonna not build a road because it will fill up, why are we building any roads at all?
We ought to just stop.
So it seriously goes to the heart of when you say, we put Carpo as a con and everything. I mean, Carpo's sense, which comes out of a fascinating study, a long period of time, is that the road is going to fill up. And not to belabor the point that over the 50 years, there will be enhancements to this particular corridor.
Perhaps.
Contemplated in the project. Well, that's the concept. That's the concept. That's why I said, wait a minute, that's why it was contemplated in the contract. And then what we need, because it will do that, is we need reliable travel time. We need a corridor, or portions of the corridor, that will always have reliable travel time. And so when we say there is a con at Carpo, it is because the belief is that as we congest as a region, we need to have certain lanes that always provide reliable travel time. And so I think it was contemplated and is contemplated that we will widen. And I think those that say the costs are prohibitive, Secretary, when you think about the state of North Carolina, and you think about costs that we have to incur that are, instead of just being able to put asphalt in, think about cutting the mountains. Think about Highway 12 on the coast. We have unique costs that are associated with those, yet those projects still get scored and they still pass. So the fact that there may be a remuneration required, compensation, it's just a cost.
And to that point, I agree with you. And which is why I tend to think that what we end up with is something that appreciates that travel time as part of an ultimate solution, but also appreciates an increase in capacity. And I think there are options out there that could do that we haven't necessarily talked about particularly, but I think you're right. I think you do have to have, and in talking to the city of Charlotte DOT, the travel time is important for most anybody here. The problem is, as it's currently structured, it is that versus capacity, and you have one or not the other. And I think ultimately what we have to
is a vital piece of this entire scenario that we're dealing with.
So,
No, I think.
sorry, just real quick, Mr. Hedberg, so that's a key thing for the option F is the traffic advantage?
Truck, absolutely, you could put that on there.
One of the things we're moving to rapidly is within the STI process, how do we measure, model freight movements and put points on freight movements, critical freight flows, because we believe those are extremely important, as you guys already know. So that's a newer component in our model now, and you'll see it taking a more prominent role.
Do you think that's going to have an effect on the STI?
It does.
It does more?
Yeah, matter of fact, in the current scoring, it's part of that model.
Just a quick point of clarification. I know I heard trucks or as a pro, we still have the same pavement design out there, so.
Right. That's what happens. It is a product.
Well,
I think it is.
Well, the
might be restricted.
The logic being, yeah, restricted to the 2 right lanes, which should be moving because you've added capacity.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, you're not adding any more than what's out there. You're just allowing everybody to use all the lanes for free.
Well,
in this scenario, right? I
in this
just want to make
scenario-
sure, because there's a lot of talk about the options, and sometimes I think we're talking about different options. I just want to make sure.
Currently, under what we have, 60% is automotive. If I'm able to move half of that, if under this scenario, and again, I'm not arguing with this scenario. What I'm saying is, if I'm able to take, 50% of the 60% off, then suddenly I have far more capacity for truck through traffic because I've taken automotive traffic out of the 2 general purpose lanes. So it becomes much more of a freight lane because there is the opportunity to go around the trucks. Currently, that's not the
In
case.
essence, becomes a 4-lane highway because the trucks stay to the right as they
Yeah,
do
it's-
now on
it's-
3-lane highways. The trucks often stay in the right 2
Yeah,
lanes
it's
or are
not
required to.
going through I-77 in Charlotte, you're restricted to right-hand lanes, truck only at certain times.
That's
So-
fine. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, so it doesn't, yeah, you're right, it doesn't add capacity, it doesn't add square footage, but it allows you to take automotive capacity off of the 2 general purpose lanes, which in effect gives you more capacity for freight.
You're looking to
Makes sense?
maximize the cars and everything.
Yeah.
So-
I would also add, having it state-owned for a pro would help to rebuild trust with the people. Would improve credibility with the whole project.
Okay, so that's a offshoot of this, but a specific advantage is rebuild trust with citizens of the area. Other pros and cons? I know people are already looking at if it's not this or not that, is there something in between? I know people may be wanting to come up with some other combination, and I just want to see if we're finished here with the major pros
Well,
and
at the
cons.
risk of stirring up this hornet's nest again, I could see a scenario where you have a $655 million project, which you're ready to buy out for $289 million. I think that's a good deal.
Okay, so a question is a potential lower or low buyout amount, at least in how you're looking at this. Yeah.
How about something like significantly less than cost of construction or something like that? Because low is a relative term.
Okay.
Secretary, is Centra aware of these advisory group meetings? I mean, any of their listening?
It's available to the entire public.
For notable, maybe. Not just in. But go ahead, I'm trying to say.
Con, to get from our point A to where we are right now, to point B to what he was talking about, that value, striking that price value. To me, a con or a cloud in my brain is, how do we get from point A to point B? I don't see us, there's a lot of variables there. We'd have to negotiate and get it down to 260-some thousand. There's a lot of things that have to be done between point A and point B. And how do you toss those balls and keep all three of them in the air at the same time and make it meet those strike dates?
I like your balls in the air. I started something a little simpler. There's so many variables, there are many steps to get to the goal, so that uncertainty, at least in part, if I'm reading you, Mr. Brady, is a con.
I almost feel like this group has lost its charge about, and this hurts me to say this, but I'm extremely conservative, about the money. This kind of reminds me of a scenario of a friend of mine on his fourth divorce. He said, you know why it costs so much? And I said, no. He said, because it's worth it. And the reason I say that is do we think this is a bad fit for this area? Not looking at the money side of it, but is this not the project that needs to be done for this area? And so with that being said, as hard as it is to say no look at money, we're not going to be able to charge what we're going to find them anyway. That's what's going to come with our recommendation. They'll have to go find the money. They'll have to figure out, we can use our power to influence legislators maybe, but they're going to have to go find it. Ours is option F our best option? I think it is. And regardless of the money and whatever time it takes, is it going to end up making it better for us as far as many, many reasons in this area? And that's the whole charge of this committee. I think we've kind of lost our way in a lot of money and talks. It's about what's going to be good for us in the future going forward.
Well, and I think, I mean, to the point, I'm going to be full disclosure on the cons. I think to Ned's point that Charlotte needs a guaranteed travel time to Charlotte. Lake Norman is interested in obviously relieving congestion. So if we just complete and delete as it is, Charlotte does not get their guaranteed travel time. So is that a tolling that gives you the guaranteed travel time to Charlotte? I think there's a political con there.
I agree with you. I interpret that as the only cargo. You're right to point
I think there's something.
I would say, I hear from folks who live in Charlotte that work at major employers up here that see it just the opposite, the other way too. They want a lot of travel time.
Understood. And you have a very valid point, is the congestion, but the interesting thing, the congestion doesn't start at downtown Charlotte. The congestion starts at 23.
Today.
Well, the STI is the, let's say you score high on the STI, does that say that you reach out there and get $265 million up to $600 million? Does that say we've approved this and you're gonna get the dollars, whatever it is in that range?
So, and I'll give you the majority of the time. Majority of the time, we do feasibility studies on projects that says, okay, we believe this is the range, this is the estimated cost. We submit that for scoring with that scope of work. It scores high, then our budget is that number. In this case, and I was anticipating for this group, we may have to run things with a range so you can see what they look like hypothetically, and we could do all of those.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm with you on the cost is no object thing. I think that cost, that.
It matters.
Well, I'm saying that a lower cost is a good option if we could relieve congestion and.
I would just tell you, and not this isn't a critique or anything, but the two most difficult things that drive project delivery in North Carolina is cost and environmental process. Those are the two most time consuming. So I would love to hear the feedback. Don't get bogged down too much in the methodology to get there. Just say, we believe this is the right outcome.
Right.
We believe this is the right outcome. Then we can work with you on how we get there.
So that's fair. So along those lines, noting the time is about 2:40, and clearly we're not at a level of detail that at least I perceive people are ready to complete their input. So for the remaining time, I'm going to suggest we at least look at how we've done comparisons across all the options, and can combine the pros and cons. It seems like there's a good appetite for what are the pieces, or is there something new beyond that. But first, I'm sorry, I see two hands to see if you want to go a different way, but I'm going to suggest we do look at the comparison in brief.
Before we go to the comparison, to me, comparison is the summary. And I think many of us in this room are looking at option E, develop preliminary to negotiate and finance purchase by next person after completion, but some variations, and maybe it's D, some variations that we want to discuss. In the summary, it's kind of like, these were the options, these 6 options and a few variations were brought to us on meeting 1. We have since as a group had, hey, there are other options that I think need to be addressed prior to that, and I think and I guess with that, Mr. Secretary, would that fall under option E, you know, of variations of this, or where would we stick that, I guess, as I'm looking for direction?
Not worry where you stick it, just articulate.
Yes.
Okay, well.
I think about a catch-all like B was a catch-all, and do something else like complete and modify or something like
Yeah,
that.
well, that's what I was thinking, complete and modify. Well, and I guess I'll throw out the first one, and what we haven't done and talked about at all is the use of the shoulders, hardened shoulders during peak times.
John, let's go ahead and number these, so kind of straight.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have particular locations in mind when you throw that out?
28 to 33.
Yeah,
Across the.
Yeah, I think I think we all who live here know that the congested area is frankly 23 to 31, maybe 32, you know what I mean? And you could argue to 36, but the reality is the critical points is 23 to across the lake. You know, those are the ones that once you get by that. And that could inherently open things up to, I'm not saying a solution to Secretary Draga's point is, hey, it's a solution to help move us along the way.
And then I'll go P.
I'm sorry, Mr. Russell first, and then we'll come on down.
We've talked a lot about the 2 causeways over the lake and how we're going to get the last piece of dry land over Lake Norman. Is it possible to expand within the existing dike or berm, whatever we call it, where you can take advantage of that footprint without getting into the lake itself and triggering all sorts of environmental reviews, getting tube involved, and other government agencies and so forth, so that we can take a look at what would be the cost of adding additional GP lanes over the causeways without having to go through 10, 15 years of time.
So am I capturing this correctly? Then, okay. Other voices from down here? Yes, Mr. Bucket.
Well, and listening to Ned, you know, if you listen to me and Ned, then go and study and do what you want to do. I couldn't, you know, I completely understand what he says. So I would like to see an option that would be a combination of expansion of general purpose lane and a toll lane. In this case, I think just because of what we're doing, it would be 1 additional general purpose lane and the keeping of 1 toll lane. And how that would impact possible SDI also. Because when you look at SDI, one of the things we talk about, one now is if we factor in the freight component of it, I think we score much higher than we normally would have. If we're looking at a limited area, that's the case. But if you bring revenue to it, it's an entirely different animal also. So whereas I would love to have lots of general purpose lanes, if at the end of the day, I have to get through CRTPO, which means I've got to have guaranteed travel time, then, you know, I'd like to at least get some scenario of a hybrid.
I'm sorry, so of the 2 express lanes, 1 toll, 1 general purpose, including heavy trucks?
No, I don't think you can. I think the only reasonable, in the foreseeable future, to get your way out of this morass is you're going to have to stick with freight on 2 lanes. How do you add as much capacity on those 2 lanes by removing automotive at the time being?
You're talking about tolling over the causeway?
I think you have to have three general purpose lanes over the causeway. Now, to Mr. Russell's, interesting proposition of, is it possible to have 4? That's absolutely worth talking about. So I mean, that kind of gets into the, what this would look like when you look at 1 toll lane. Where does that toll lane end? Is it in south of Lake Norman? Does it go across Lake Norman? Those are things that DOT could consider. But that at least gives you kind of a bit of a compromise. It gives you guaranteed times. It allows bus, I'll be honest, I talked to Ron Tober about this. Asked Ron Tober, Ron, if you had a toll lane that could give you bus rapid transit, would that work in, at least in the foreseeable future for mass transit? And he said, yeah. And so it's not a long-term solution any more than this is a long-term solution, but it does at least give you an option.
How would you do it from 28 to 36?
From 28 to 36 would have to be
We have
either,
one.
you would basically have the toll lane would pick up south of the lake,
Okay.
unless, as Mr. Russell said, there's actually greater capacity in there than we have.
I don't see that.
I'd like to ask Mr. Mitchell, has the DOT done anything to look to see if there's space in that for a fourth lane each way?
Right now, there's not capacity and maintaining the ample shoulder width as required by federal guidelines.
So, let me just parrot back and maybe refine. So, when we look at the scenarios that call for termination or completion, while we're in this process, they're all pretty ugly. I mean, they have uncertainty associated with time. So if you, and if you listen to Kurt in terms of whatever line you pick, if you said, all right, we're gonna complete. Then we're gonna measure and evaluate if there's an opportune time to buy this contract out. It could be the project is not doing as well, therefore it's limited to the senior debt, or even if it's doing well, there might be a scenario by which you say, I want to buy it out. But perhaps challenging NCDOT to say, come up with the metrics of annual biannual evaluation of whatever the cancellation value will be. And it makes sense, and maybe it's something that should be part of STI. But parallel with that, or coincidental with that, under STI, you would be submitting projects for portions of 23 to 31, included within the parameters of the contract. So what's it going to cost? What is the evaluation of the cost to say, look, Centra, if Centra still runs it, we want to do this. Here's the cost, and it makes sense because then it's suggested up. And the causeway issue is one that for years we've all said, my God, let me go out of that. But you know what? We cost body, DOT. We buy the water all the time. So there's a cost to it, there's an environmental challenge. Sometimes when you sit down on the front end with the environmental group and say, this is how we want to deal with it, bridge it, instead of in the middle of wiping it. You don't know. I mean, do those things now. Have those conversations now. Or try to get these enhancements done during STI. Is that an element of what you're?
Well, all knowledge is absolutely the best thing to have, because that's the only way you're going to get some type of reasonable assumption is the best way to go forward. One of the things that I continue to talk about that we don't talk about here is for me, from the economic development piece of this, the downside of that we never talk about. And by the way, people have been invited. Jeff and I have a group meeting on Wednesday night at the Charles Mack Center in Mooresville at 6. Come listen to the economic downside as it sits today, or at least have some questions answered. But that's the other part of this we're not talking about. So when we go back and we talk about the fact that when this was designed, it took none of that into consideration. I am thrilled to death that the current leadership in DOT is now saying, look, we have to start paying attention to freight as you go forward, particularly in major metro areas. You know, that's the type of thing that we have to go back into Raleigh sometime and go, you know, as I say all the time, when government makes mistakes, it tends to be big and expensive mistakes. Mecklenburg County has made their share of them, and we will continue to do it, and it costs a lot of money to fix them, but you ultimately have the responsibility to the public to go, it seemed like a good idea, it was a bad idea, we have to now fix it, and how do we do that? And so to your point, the number of variables you have to start to figure out what the best one of those is, works. At some point, Central, you can say this is the best one. Central goes, no way whatsoever, the contract doesn't allow that, and you start to negotiate out of the contract. If Central goes, you know what, better than nothing, you know, I'm not against necessarily, you know, a private company running a toll lane if it makes sense beyond everything else.
No, I'll just jump in, Jim. I disagree. I think, you know, almost everybody around this table has said that it's a bad contract, and I don't want to try to shine this thing to something that it was never intended to be.
And I'm not saying do that at all. Because I'm saying it's a fundamental change to the contract that they would either agree to or not. But it's an absolutely no. There is no way in the world I would ever say this contract stays as it is. But I'm also not going to say absolutely beyond a shadow of doubt that there's not any potential contract that couldn't be negotiated. I don't know what it would be, but I have learned every time I say absolutely not, there is that one exception. So I'll at least cover my bases there.
Ms. Ivory, then Mr. Curran.
No, I just want to go on record and say that I feel like we should need to go ahead and complete, and I think that we should do the evaluation, as you said, Mayor, and as you had alluded to, Jim. And then basically, do the evaluation and then work with CRTPO to, number D, to identify projects. I heard very clearly, that there are, frustrations and there are concerns, and we need to look at 21 and 115. We need to identify the other things and see what we can work on. I've heard a couple of things, that this is quality. We don't even know what's going to happen. There is uncertainty, and I am concerned about the funding and the money. And I hear that they put in, or they are committed to over $200 million. And the minimum, even if it's not $600 million, there's still $289 million. So I am concerned about the monies, and you say NCPOT will take care of that. I'm not convinced that taxpayers will not have to incur some of that. So I'm not convinced.
They will.
Right.
Yeah, they will.
So
Still money well spent.
Yeah, and so because of that, there's too many uncertainties, and I say, we need to work with the company to say, these are the things that we want to look at in negotiation.
I'm sorry, so hold on just a second. I'll come to you next and then Mr. Curran. But I wanted to make sure, maybe this is wrong as a new option, Mr. Curran. I was just trying to, is this really a variation on one of the option Ds or something like that? Or I'm trying to, since we finished with option F, that's why I went G, H, I, J, but is this really a new option, or are you focusing on one of the other ones?
E says purchase the project after completion. I mean, I think it's
So this is more.
Submitting projects to me is it's the day-to-day form.
Should be happening.
It's broken.
Okay, so otherwise, before going to Ms. Cawthon, Heart and Shoulders, at least I've labeled as an option G. Question about the causeway, which I think may have already been answered, at least to some degree, and then the idea of one toll lane, one general purpose lane, open to mid-weight trucks, not heavy trucks. Is that right?
We sharpen that just a little bit, so are we talking, because if we got an answer on E, that we can't expand over the causeway, right, in anybody's lifetime. So does that not affect, so are we talking about 2 toll lanes to Morrisville, or are we talking about 2 toll lanes to Cornelius?
For me, there is.
I'm asking you, Jim, yeah, because I think you've got a positive.
There has to be a minimum of 3 general purpose lanes over the causeway. Under any scenario, anything, under anything we're talking about. Anything, otherwise it is the new Yadkin River Bridge. Right. No, anybody who wants to say otherwise is crazy to say that an interstate will squeeze down to 2 general purpose lanes is looking at the Yadkin River Bridge in the foreseeable future. There's just no argument about that. I'm sure somebody could argue about it. But for me, that's what happens. And so the expansion becomes more expensive further down the road. So, to Ned's point, you can always do it, but it gets more and more expensive to do that. So no, it's not a total lane to cross that unless you.
Was there some other clarification you wanted to?
No, I just want to make sure, so what we're talking about basically, because it's convenient, that there are currently 2 toll lanes in each direction up to exit 28. We're basically talking, and then a pair of toll lanes on. We're talking about leaving 1 toll lane in each direction, Charlotte to exit 28, and then adding basically general purpose lanes, or converting those to general purpose lanes up to exit 36.
What I want to know is, what can we do within the existing footprint of those causeways, where you've got, underneath the water, it continues.
No, I don't think we.
No,
I don't think they looked at it.
on that, because you've got to say what that footprint is, and what can we do within the limits of that footprint.
So we can look at some design options. It's not just the geometry, the width, it's also how you construct it. drilling through a pile of rocks.
You can.
That's a little
I
bit.
mean, but still, we build bridges all over the Outer Banks.
Yeah.
I mean, they're beautiful bridges for miles and miles and miles.
It's a challenge, but it's not a challenge.
Okay, I've had Ms. Cotham on hold, please.
I just kind of wanted to go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, and Jeff's comment that he made earlier about the money and, you know, we're looking at the cost. But I would just like us to keep looking at what is the right thing to do for the people. And to have that as our focus as opposed to the money. And if we have to work harder for the money, then we have to. But I know, again, I don't have the experience that you all have with this type of business, but I know since I've been county commissioner, we had a problem with a terrible reval, which affected, this is how I got to know everybody, the disaster that happened in 2011. And then I came on in 2012. When we got to work to fix that, we never really talked about what it was going to cost us, and it ended up that we had to return like $110 million. One county, we had to do that, and then we spent about $8 million on consulting fees. And but we were driven by it was the right thing to do because we failed. We had not done our job correctly, and we had to correct it, and that was what was right. And so we ended up and we sent all this money back. And immediately we received a whole lot of trust from the people because they were like, finally, we got, things were turning around. But we never really focused on, well, yeah, this is going to cost us a lot of money, maybe we just need to shortchange these people. So I would just like us to really stay focused on, as like Jeff was talking about, and putting the money aside and what is the right thing? And then we all have to work harder to advocate with Raleigh than we do. So I just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Okay, we're a little at about 5 minutes or less from our stated ending time. Secretary, clearly, I think it sounds like the folks do want to have one more bite at the apple now that we've put even a couple more apples or other kinds of fruit variations on the board. Members, please know it's only 2 weeks off, so there's limited in terms of what any background work or analysis that can be done on these options. So I just wanted to see from the members here, are there any other clarifying, much like what Mr. Noss did, about what are we really talking about? So it could be written up, it can be, you know, really thoughtfully considered at your April 30th meeting.
So are we?
I just have a question, and for NCDOT, is there any way, as part of the one toll lane, one general purpose lane, is there any modeling that could give us some predictive toll revenue in doing that, I guess is my question.
Excuse me, you have to add the specific thing in 2 weeks.
The answer is
Well, we
yes.
should
The
have
question is, we don't know, you know, how long it would take, but the answer is yes, we can do modeling.
And I'll speak what Commissioner Cost was saying, because I do want to keep in mind, Mecklenburg County, as a county, did take a $110 million hit and found $110 million in one fiscal year without raising taxes. And oh, by the way, reduced our tax values going forward by that same amount ongoing. So when we talk about $3 or $4 or $5 or $600 million across the state of North Carolina, just keep that in mind. So I don't want to worry too much about the money. It's interesting to think about the revenue. So for me, you know, Secretary Trogdon has sat through almost all these meetings. I'm sure, like me, the ones he didn't, he dutifully watched the video. You know, and I think understands kind of what our concerns are. I would love for you and staff to come back with some level of number of possible options, the absolutes and the possible, a bit of a stretch, and say, here's kind of the waterfront, from here's what I absolutely can do, or feel confident I can do, to here's what, if we don't worry about the money and it's a reasonable amount, it's not a $4 billion amount, here's kind of where we are, to give us some idea. Because the truth is, at the end of the day, I don't care what we tell him, he's going to make the best assessment he can, and his boss is going to tell him what to do. And all we can do is give him the best idea of what he thinks those options are. So that would be my thought process.
Hold on, Ms. Cashin was trying to get in, and then I'll come across.
Go ahead, I'm going to circle up.
Okay.
Well, just real quickly, being in Arbor County, I feel like I'm in a unique position. I'm in Carpo with 2 counties that are in another division than I am. I'm Division 12, they're Division 10. I've got another county in my division that's in another MPO. Actually, 3 of the counties that are in my division are another MPO from me. And they're proposing building a road across the south fork of the Catawba River. It's gonna take 2 bridges.
Yeah.
Because they said they don't have enough room on I-85, which is 8 lanes, plus 4 lanes on US 74 that parallels it. They still ain't got enough. So, like I wanted to tell you, and that's gonna suck all the money out of the whole division, the whole region, the whole thing that I'm involved in. Yeah, I'm worried about the money. Maybe I said it sort of flippantly. Yeah, there's always a cost. But like I said, and Pat agreed with me, I hope is, at the end of the day, in 50 years from now, people are gonna say, they argued over that little bit.
Right.
After all it did to us, after the way it strangled us, after the way it kept us from growing and doing anything, they argued over that. What short-sighted people they were. What a bunch of morons.
I can tell you 2 years out that the fact that we could have gotten out of it for $25 million.
And they thought we were crazy.
So, like I said, you think about an $800 million road that's gonna be built in my region and we're working. So it's all relative. It's all relative, y'all. It is doing the right thing.
Now Ms. Cashin, then Mr. Kerr, and then Mr. Russell.
So, back to our direction for the next meeting. We keep saying a lot of the same things over and over and over again, which is important. But I'm assuming our expectation is at the next meeting that we have a comprehensive list. Mrs. Cossum has asked for what you really realistically think are the stretch, what we can and can't do. But at some point, you need to almost poll this group to find, right, we need to have a list and say, this is what we want, these are the top 3, and go forward and allow them to manage the process.
Just one quick clarification. The input to the secretary is by y'all as individuals. There isn't a necessity for you to agree on every point. So we haven't been aiming for consensus. If you get to it, that's up to you, but just wanted to clarify that.
Just 2 things, Mr. Secretary, you and the team, within 2 weeks, if you could provide us some thought about whether it's within STI, P6, how would you evaluate, and we talked about this a few meetings ago, how would you evaluate, how would you affect the buyout of P3? I mean, yes, this one, but in general, how are we going to embrace that within STI? Because that might prove beneficial for us to hear. Okay, what is it going to require? Legislative remedy, can be demo within STI. And then secondly, to your point about a group, it could be the next meeting, just something to think about is that you give everybody a few minutes to just say, this is what this is where I've come down, rather than getting them to try and. This is my recommendation.
Okay, so that's, I'll take you, Mr. Russell, and then especially for how you think the last meeting will be most productive, Mr. Curran offers give everybody a chance to, briefly, to really summarize it down to what the advice is to the secretary. Mr. Russell?
I like that. From a funding source, when the DOT takes over this contract, can full revenues be put against the buyout when we repay the legislation?
Can we senior debt assumption, have that analogy figured into it too?
Those are 2 good questions. So, the first is, you can use total revenue. Generally, it has to go back to repaying bonds and outstanding debt. But once that is paid, you can use it operating the facility, but the debt comes off first, then operating the facility, maintaining all that, which will be, so your question is, could it be a loan from the General Assembly? That would still be debt. So the answer is all debt. Some of it is higher priority, we have to pay off earlier than others, but we have to pay off the debt first. Yours was?
Senior debt assumption.
That's
Assumption.
Yeah.
Total money could go to that though. 'Cause that's
Yes.
debt. That's
Yes.
a priority.
Can we get this
It has to.
Yeah, so that continues to slow.
Yeah, that's not even optional.
That has to be done.
Right.
If they're senior debt, it has to go there first.
On the assumption process too, how would that figure in with STI?
The way STI works is, it's looking at the funds, it scores a project based on its cost to the TIP. So the total revenue makes that score higher because that's not coming out of the TIP.
Since you do have one more meeting, I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Question. You know, why, if we were to buy this contract out, whether it's year 1 or year 10, why would it have to go back to the SCI process?
The source of funds to do the buyout.
So if Raleigh passes some legislative and.
And I gave the example of appropriation is separate from that process, it was outside. Grants, federal grants are separate from that process, so that's one of the things we do internally. Anything that we believe will be competitive in the federal grant process, we'd submit that, because that would be, yes, to minimize.
So quickly on what you liked or would like to change, there's a specific idea of at least how one part of your April 30th meeting would look like. Anything you liked from this meeting to carry forward or something to change?
Should we not do our J through our options that we just discussed, the pros and cons of that? And then I guess the summary and then discuss.
Okay, pros, cons of today's options would be another piece. And indeed, we had ready the combined of the before, so we'll be able to put that. But you'll have to work through that on the other ones. Other things as you look for the next meeting, what's going to be most productive for folks?
Side-by-side option review.
I'm sorry?
Side-by-side option review.
But you're talking the boil list, right?
Right.
Because some of these we've said.
Right.
I think this is, we come back with what DOT says are the most likely reasonable, and then.
Well, and then net of what we said, we're discounting.
Right.
So the boil list.
Yeah. And again, while it's quiet, Jeff Neely and I have an event Wednesday night at 6 p.m. Charles Mack, Mooresville. If you want to hear impact other than transportation, I welcome you. We're trying to work with some state legislatures in case the day ever came that we might have to do something with them.
Okay, appreciate people staying a little bit over, but otherwise, my understanding is 2 weeks from today, same time period, 1 to 3, we'll let you know the location. We'll let Secretary.
Even before you come to the meeting, we are on a tight budget.
Secretary.
That's true, yeah, on Wednesday night, that's right, there might be some water.
I wanted to say thanks to Huntersville for hosting us food today. So it looks like for our next meeting, I would anticipate we'll come back with the options we already have, be prepared to look at those side by side and see if we can get the equivalent, bring some of those, if we understand first, we'll give our understanding of what these other options that we've looked at, how they would fit in, and put as much of the information as we can on there on timelines and estimated cost if we have it, and we'll discuss all those next meeting. Then what I'd like to do is be able to take all of that, go back, start putting more data on there so we can get things ready for scoring, and then be ready to come back sometime in the July timeframe, say here's where we think everything is and here's where we think we're going. Does that sound like a reasonable?
This is not like, the next meeting is not necessarily the final meeting, right? There could be.
No. Yeah, we anticipate that we'll need to do follow-ups all through the process.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you. I just try to be respectful of everyone's time, and when we come back, we'll make sure we have information for you to consider. Thank you.
Thank you all.